All right, today we're putting on our detective hats. We're about to investigate one of the most famous meetings of minds in all of history, the exact moment that the great German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer first stumbled upon ancient Indian thought. It's a story you probably think you know, but we're about to see if the legend actually holds up.
So here's the big question. Schopenhauer's whole philosophy, with his heavy focus on suffering and this thing he called the will, just clicks so perfectly with Eastern ideas. And the story of how he found the Upanishads, it's legendary. It's often painted as this huge turning point that forever changed Western philosophy.
But hang on a second. What if that legendary story, the one that's been told in books and classrooms for over 100 years, isn't actually the real story? What if his big aha moment with Indian philosophy came from a totally different text at a completely different time?
To really get to the bottom of this, we've got to do what any good detective does. You ignore the rumors, you ignore the hearsay, and you follow the cold, hard evidence. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to dig through dusty old records, look at his actual handwritten notes, and piece together the real story step by step.
Okay, so before we dive in, let's just be super clear on the rules of this little investigation. We are not doing what you'd call a speculative comparison. Where you just say, hey, this idea kind of sounds like that idea. Nope. We are conducting a historical inquiry. That means we are only interested in solid, verifiable proof. What did Schopenhauer actually read, and when did he actually read it? That's our mission. So, let's start with the popular version of the story, the legend that's kind of grown and morphed over time. It all kicks off with a pretty simple statement from Schopenhauer himself, but as you're about to see, that little statement took on a life of its own. Here it is, straight from the man himself, way later in his life, in 1851. He says this guy, Friedrich Majer, introduced him to Indian antiquity. Now pay close attention to his words. He doesn't say Indian philosophy. He doesn't mention the Upanishads. Just this very broad, kind of vague term, Indian antiquity. But that tiny little seed of a fact, it was about to grow into a whole forest of fiction. And here's where the legend just spirals out of control. It's like a game of historical telephone. In 1942, a scholar paints this picture of Schopenhauer sitting at Majer's feet. Okay. By 1988, another scholar says Majer likely pointed him to the Upanishads. Then in the 90s, it's suddenly Hinduism and Buddhism. And by 1999, the story is that Majer literally gave him a copy of the book. With each retelling, the story gets bigger and more dramatic until we're way, way off in Fantasyland, miles away from any actual evidence.
So to get back to reality, we have to go to the archives. We need to see what Schopenhauer was really up to during that critical winter of 1813 to 1814 in a town called Weimar. And luckily for us, the records from the local libraries still exist. This is our paper trail.
Okay, check this out. This is the actual library lending register with Schopenhauer's name on it. We can see him borrowing books on optics and color theory, which totally makes sense because he was working with the famous writer Goethe on that stuff at the time. But then, on December 4th, 1813, right next to Newton's optics, he borrows something completely out of left field, the Asiatische Magazin, or Asiatic Magazine. Now look down the list. When does he borrow the famous Upanishads? March 26th, 1814. That's almost 4 months later.
This, right here, is our first big break in the case. The library records prove that months before he ever laid eyes on the Upanishads, he had this magazine in his hands. So the million-dollar question is, what in the world was in it?
Well, it was a journal, basically a collection of articles and essays all about Asia. And who was one of its main writers? You guessed it, none other than Friedrich Majer, the exact guy Schopenhauer said gave him his introduction to Indian antiquity. And tucked away inside this magazine was one of the very first German translations of a major Indian philosophical text.
Okay, this is where the case just blows wide open. We threw out the legend, we followed the paper trail, and it led us right here. We have a suspect text, we have a timeline, but we need that one piece of definitive proof. We need this smoking gun that shows Schopenhauer actually read it and that it mattered. And this is it. A page from Schopenhauer's own unpublished private notes. Just look at the heading he wrote himself. From the Asiatische Magazin, Bhagavadgītā. This is it. This is undeniable. It's case closed. His very first notes on Indian philosophy were not from the Upanishads. They were from a translation of the Bhagavadgītā that he found in that magazine.
And that 4-month gap is everything. He was reading and thinking about the Bhagavad Gita all the way back in December of 1813.
He didn't even check out the Upanishads, the book from the legend, until the end of March 1814. This completely rewrites the timeline. It means his first real taste of Indian thought came right at the moment he was building the core ideas for his masterpiece, The World as Will and Representation.
Now for the really exciting part. I mean, it's one thing to prove what he read and when he read it, but can we actually prove it mattered? Can we see the ideas from that specific translation popping up in his own philosophical notes from that exact same time? So, in the section of the Bhagavadgītā that Schopenhauer was taking notes on, the god Krishna explains this really key concept. He says, realize that the word kshetra signifies body. The idea is that the body is the field, the kshetra, and the soul is the knower of that field. It's this profound idea that frames our physical body as the main place we gain knowledge.
And then, almost immediately in his own private notes from early 1814, Schopenhauer writes this absolutely world-changing sentence: "The body is nothing other than the will that has become visible." That's it. That's the cornerstone of his entire system. The idea that we can understand the hidden reality of the world, what he calls the will, through the direct, immediate knowledge of our own bodies. It's an absolutely electrifying connection. It's a straight line from the text he was reading to a massive breakthrough in his own philosophy.
So, mystery solved. We found the real first encounter. But why does this matter? I mean, who cares? Well, it's actually a really big deal. It's more than just fixing a date in a textbook. It fundamentally changes how we understand the birth of one of the most important philosophies to come out of the West.
Let's just recap what our detective work uncovered. First, the real first encounter was with the Bhagavadgītā, a text all about action, duty, and metaphysics, not the purely mystical Upanishads from the Upanishads. Second, this all went down in December 1813, way earlier than anyone thought. This gives us a totally new origin story for his philosophy, showing these Indian ideas were bubbling up right as he was forming his main concepts. And finally, it just goes to show that sometimes the real story, the one you find when you dig for the evidence, is so much cooler than the myth.
And that leaves us with one last big thought. We just unraveled a really influential legend simply by going back to the primary source. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other things that we take as historical fact are just comfortable stories that we've repeated so many times we forgot to check the receipts? What other incredible discoveries are just sitting there, waiting in an old library logbook for a detective to come along and follow the trail?